Greetings comic lovers, and today we're here with a super casual video. One of the things I get asked a lot on this channel, well, there are a couple of questions. One is what's on your shelves, but it's usually preceded by why are they not organized in any capacity? I can't fully answer that, but I can answer what's on it. Sometimes the question that comes up is where do I start? What comics should I read? And I'm never exactly certain what to recommend, so I thought it would be fun to just go through some of my favorite books. So I want to preface this by saying that these aren't the best, the most historically significant, the creme de la creme that you need to read to be the ultra nerd. These are just books that I pull off whenever I feel like I want to read something, the ones I gravitate towards the most. Also, the metric for it was, it became quite amusing. It became one of those things where I was trying to decide what was worthy. You know, your house is on fire, your family, your pets, everybody else is safe. You run in and you grab, and that wasn't working. And then it was you're trapped on an island, you have to read these books for it. That didn't work either. So eventually I just settled on you wander into the room in a fairly neutral mood. Not super sad, super angry, super happy, just pretty even keel, and you feel like reading. What do you grab? And I selected 10 based on that criteria. There aren't going to be too many omnis here just because in general, when it's just a quick casual grab it to read it, they're pretty big and heavy. So that's more of a decision of today we shall be perusing an omni. I have a pile beside me. I have notes. It's a whole thing. Also, I think I'm gonna go in reverse order from the way that I did them just because that's how they're piled now. So the notes will be backwards, but that's fine. My goal and hope for this video is just that you enjoy it, enjoy hanging out, and also maybe you get some recs or something to read. Maybe you've read some of these and you want to chat about them. Also, of course, I want you to leave some of your favorites that you just pick up to read when you feel like it down below. Oh yeah, these are also physical. The digital comics are a separate thing. And also not something that I can just casually go to because I gotta go get the tab, gotta do the thing. It's not the same. I like digital comics, but it's not the same. It's just yoink. At least not for me. Miles may vary. I know some people prefer it. So first on the favorites list, we have Harleen by Stay Upon Sage. This was originally released from 2019 to 2020 under the Black Label imprint. We did videos on it as it was coming out. It's 3 issues. I have the hardcover edition because it's a gorgeous cover. And let me show you what's underneath the slip. There you go. Look, see? It's a gorgeous double cover experience. In general, this book is just beautiful. The art inside it is very lovely. It would be earning a spot on just something that I casually pick up and flip through, but this is one that I smack in the mic. But this is one that I pick up and read because this book really gets Harley Quinn. More so than many things have time of recording. You get to see her through and through, the tragedy, her flaws, the appeal of the relationship with her and the Joker, the danger of it, the hints at the beginning of the genesis of the relationship between her and Ivy. You get to see the bad manipulative aspects of her, the foundations of abuse, everything. Harley is one of my favorite characters, although at times I sometimes feel like using the word was. And that's because of the way her character is oft times utilized time of recording. And it has nothing to do with the idea of putting her back with a Joker or anything like that. They had been moving her away from that since before the New 52. It's that something has shifted at the character's core that has left her far less interesting and, in my opinion, far more annoying. Her charm and intelligence and manipulativeness and danger have been replaced with constant attempts at humor, manic energy, and in many cases, a fear of acknowledging her flaws or past actions, either for minding them as a source of conflict or growth. This isn't every take, but it is the overall vibe. Now, there were always comedic and fun elements to Harley, but it feels like sometimes those just take the forefront and supplant absolutely everything. There's a big push to make Harley Quinn a symbol of empowerment, and I'm not sure if that works from a company level. If people and fans take empowerment from her, that's one thing, but to try and turn her around and make her that figure for young girls, I'm not sure it entirely lands, personally. In many ways, time of recording, she feels stagnant. And that's not even to say she can't become a more anti-hero type character, but it's the way that's being done. It's simply not great most of the time. She's such a cool, nuanced character, and a lot of the times what you see these days is just over-the-top quirk. But not here. Not with this Harley. You get all the Harley, and that includes those more fun and humorous aspects. You can see those elements and what it is that people like about them, but you can also see the darkness, a bit more of that grit, which is especially important to highlight the fact that that was there in Harleen before the Joker. This book is a really interesting thing where it parallels her with Two-Face for parts of it, with Harvey Dent, because it's before either of them have become who they will become, and they start to in this book. Most importantly, Harley has agency in this story. You see that she is manipulated, but she also manipulates. She is used, but she uses others as well. It really makes you think about the different aspects of the character and how there are so many facets to her. I don't know why I said to her so awkwardly there, but I did. And one of the most important aspects, you can see from her perspective the appeal of the relationship with the Joker, which is important in understanding her. It makes her more relatable, not less. To be able to understand how she got into that relationship and how that mistake and everything came to be is foundational. Yes, of course, you can move her away and she doesn't have to go back to him or anything like that, but just for that to be the root, the foundation, that's fine. That's part of who she is. It doesn't make her less. It's one of the things that's interesting. Anyway, this book is gorgeous. If you are a fan of Harley, either modern Harley or classic Harley, there's something for you here. So this, definitely worth it. And if for nothing else, gorgeous. Just a gorgeous book. With this hardcover edition, you also get some of the extras, the sketches. There was gonna be some follow-ups and sequels that didn't end up happening, but this still feels very complete on its own. So this one, Harleen. Next, we have, oh, the glare. We have Luthor, Brian Azzarello, and Lee Bermejo. This was initially released as 5 issues called Lex Luthor, Man of Steel. I think just calling it Luthor is the stronger title. This initially came out in 2005, and it's a character study of Luthor. It's told from his perspective. It's basically looking at Metropolis and Superman through his viewpoint. It's another very good looking book. Lee Bermejo's art has a kind of grit to it, whereas before with the last book you had a more flowing romantic art style. This is very much, it has a violence to it, which works in terms of what it's depicting. I picked this up at the height of watching Smallville, and I was very attached to Luthor as a character, and it is very interesting, and I think it does a good job of selling why Luthor dislikes Superman and presenting it in such a way that it doesn't seem outlandish or beyond the pale. And the art really does some good lifting in this regard because it really presents Superman as this menacing figure. He looks very scary in this book, and that works. For a vast majority of this, it's very easy to sink into Lex Luthor's headspace, or at least be able to appreciate it. But then the book very quickly pulls you back to know there are lots of things wrong with Lex. So this is very interesting. Lex is a character who has shifted a decent amount over time. Since post-crisis, he very much settled into the evil businessman, but they have put back a lot of the tech villain elements from when he was in the Silver Age. There was a whole kerfuffle in the Golden Age where it seems like he was almost fused with the Ultra Humanite at one point. It's very fascinating. A book like this really highlights some of the layers behind Lex and what makes Lex interesting. So I always like coming back to this. I like it better than its counterpart series, Joker, which is playing much more with the Dark Knight kind of Joker. There's a tragedy in this story, but it's all of Lex's own making. It's a fascinating read. All right, get ready for it. You can all laugh at me now. It's The Watchmen by Alan Moore. 1986 to 1987. Basic choices basic, I know. So this is Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. It's a classic and it's considered a seminal graphic novel, a must read. I have to say, I'm one of those people who is on that train that I think you should read this. I think it is very, very good. I've heard some say that they feel it's overrated. I wouldn't say it's overrated, but I would say that it's at times over-referenced and overhyped. I can see if someone comes at you really hard with like, oh my God, this is the best graphic novel of all time. And then you read it, you may not feel that so much. I think it's really interesting, and I think it's the best to just read it for its own merits, not to go into it for the whole like this is the start of deconstructionism or these characters are taking from the charlatan. Yes, all the things are true, but I think at this point in time, just because of time of recording and everything, it's just best to go into it and read it as its own entire thing, and I think it works best that way. All those other elements are really interesting, but there's so much in here that can often get overlooked if you start pulling into all those other things. For one thing, it's just incredibly well written, and it has the multiple forms of storytelling. Some of it are little chapters with prose. The rest of it is that 9-panel formatting. In my opinion, the characters are very interesting. I know some find them flat, and there's a whole kerfuffle about whether you should enjoy certain characters or not. Alan Moore has been very vocal about his opinions about this work, which have shifted over time, just getting more and more and more negative, and about certain characters that is there as well, and that is also fascinating. But again, I think it's best to just come to this work and see what you get out of it. This is something that I could talk about the Watchmen for days. The only reason I don't on this channel is because I feel like everybody talks about the Watchmen and has their takes out there. I don't know if I have anything that's unique enough to warrant, like, let's go in. I really enjoy this, and the way that it examines the different roles of heroism, justice, and in some ways, what you can get out of it is very different than some of what Moore put into it or tried to put into it. And that's one of the things I find fascinating. And that really centralizes around the characters of like Rorschach, Ozymandias, Dr. Manhattan. Those are my 3 faves, actually, in this work. I'd say it's worth it. Even if one doesn't end up enjoying it though, I'd say this is an important one if you end up getting into comics as a hobby and you want to understand some of the how we got to where we are in terms of comics as a medium. This is one of the important ones. Again, that doesn't mean you're gonna like it. There are some that are important that I do not care for. I'm thinking about them in my mind. This work is very unique. The fallout, what came from it, not all of it is the best, but I'd say this as a unique experience, love it. Let me give you some backstory too. What's funny is that I came to this after the movie. And so I had seen the movie and really liked it beforehand. And there was somebody I was talking to who was like, oh, if you like that, you've got to read this. It's so much better. The changes, you're going to hate them. And so I'm one of those people who actually thinks there are some things that the movie did better. And I will stand by that. I know it's blasphemous. That's the one thing about this. There's a bit of a fervent cultness about Alan Moore's opinion about some things that can occur. And so there are some who won't even look at any of the extra material because he hates it so much. But I mean, at this point, he wouldn't even keep this in his house. So I don't know. I just like discussing it. I think it's interesting. Let me know. Should we talk about this someday? I feel very rambly. So let's leave this obvious choice alone and go to another obvious choice. Huzzah! Hush! It's Batman Hush. This is by Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee. It collects part of an arc that was released initially inside of the main Batman comics. They were issues 608 to 619. Now, people like to roast this comic a bit because it culminates in, the guy who looked like he did it? Cool. However, this is here and I revisit it all the time because this is the comic that made me a comic fan forever. I've talked about my genesis a few times on this channel, and while I had read some comics when I was younger, and doing this channel has actually unlocked some of those memories, this is the first one that I had purchased with my own money that I went through, and that cemented the idea that I really liked this medium and I wanted to collect and get involved in it. This channel would not exist without Batman Hush. It really wouldn't. The building blocks were there, but this comic was the final piece. I think this comic is worth checking out. It's a very good, in my opinion, gateway comic for Batman. For one thing, most of the characters in it you'll recognize from other adaptations or the like. The art is, again, absolutely gorgeous. The plot is easy to follow as for what's going on. There is a new villain, a mysterious villain called Hush. He's trying to take out Batman. He's doing things that are altering the way that Batman's villains are operating. So he's having all of these fights with them that are their MOs are a bit different. You have Poison Ivy controlling Superman. You have this extra mutated Killer Croc. You also have, this is a very important one for the Bat-Cat relationship. For the post-crisis timeline, this is the arc where Bruce reveals himself to her and they really are firm in their relationship, and it kind of presents the whole endgame, them as endgame for this time period. So if you like that, this is for you. If you don't, oh, I'm so sorry. This is where it happened. It's also a very solid Riddler story, which I appreciate, even though the clues are very haphazard and thrown in there at the end. It could have been better constructed. The movie adaptation tries that, but I will take this over the question mark in the middle of the forehead Riddler any day of the week. That's just me though.
What's a bat to do?
This is also the story where Jason returns. Kinda. They seed it here. At first it was supposed to be Jason, then they changed it and it was Clayface, but then they revealed that Jason's not in his grave anymore, so this is also important for that. It doesn't have the same weight as, say, a Watchmen, but it's just a very fun comic as well. There are many who aren't a fan of how Loeb writes. He does these very big, bombastic, off-the-wall kind of plots. For me, they very much embrace being comic booky. Some of them may be comic book a bit too close to the sun, which is a funny thing to say about the medium, but if you've read some of the more outlandish ones, you'll know what I mean. This is just very solid. It's one of those things where it's not reinventing the wheel, but what it's doing is interesting and fun. It's more of an enjoying the journey though, and seeing Batman interact with all of the you get to see these great moments with him and Nightwing, Robin, those things, Batman interacting and fighting his villains. That's what's really more worth it than the end reveal of who Hush is. And for a story that presents itself as a bit of a mystery, I can see that being a problem for some, because you want the mystery to have all that weight. For me, it ended up landing and it was just, wow, comics are fun and cool. Next, we're hopping over to someone who I've mentioned that I'm a fan of multiple times on this channel but never talked about, but here it's his time. Deadpool by Daniel Way, Volume 1. This is another one of the early additions to the collection. I just picked it up. It was one of those things where I didn't know anything about Deadpool at all when I picked this up. Didn't know as much about Marvel because I was getting more into the DC side of things when I first started. But I liked this cover and I thought it looked cool and I flipped through it and I liked the art and I took it home with me and I love it. Good choice. I collected this entire run, but I always come back when I restart and pick this one. There's a lot of fun stories in here. I like talking about this one as well because this really highlights that you can jump in anywhere, because this one just throws you into the middle of the Skrull invasion. I had no idea what was going on when I picked this up and I loved it. I just figured it out pretty much. This is also a very interesting period for Deadpool as a character in terms of how he's being depicted. We're definitely in though he's more funny than having all the darkness that we had in the classic Deadpool era, even though some of that's present, but he's not to the point where the humor has superseded everything about the character, which is something that I find can happen with Deadpool later on. If you like the character of Deadpool, this is a pretty solid entry point. As with everything with Deadpool though, because there is that humor element, if you don't like the humor of the author that they're implementing into Deadpool, it's gonna be a bit of a struggle. I found that the humor wasn't overwhelming. What was there seemed to work for the character because it's a bit on the darker side, a bit less on the heavy pop culture reference side. It's still there though, of course. That's always a thing with Deadpool, aggressively breaking the fourth wall, but not as aggressively in this as he does sometimes. For me, this is just a fun comic book romp. This is also the period where Deadpool has the multiple narration boxes. I don't know, this just really landed for me. It's one of those things where I don't have too much to say about this one. It is a Deadpool run that happened, but I keep coming back to it. So you get 1 to 12 in here, you get Wolverine Origins in here, and there's one more thing you get. What do you get? Thunderbolts, 130 to 131. The Deadpool 1 to 12 with Daniel Way writing and Paco Medina on art for most of it is the thing that I like the most out of this. It's lots of action, it's lots of Skrulls, it's lots of over-the-topness, but it really just sold me on Deadpool as a character, and I went and collected everything Deadpool for years. I have so many collections of Deadpool back there. But when I'm feeling Deadpool, I tend to pick this one up first. So yeah, Deadpool, Volume 1, Daniel Way. I know it didn't get quite as long a section, but that doesn't mean that I don't love it. I still love you. Next up, Johnny, the Homicidal Maniac, by Johan Vasquez. This is a very interesting comic that has gone on quite the journey with me. It's one of the early editions as well. One of my first forays into alternative comics, like beyond indie, this is alternative. It was initially a comic strip in the 90s, even though Vasquez came up with the idea, the base idea in high school. And really, a lot of it is fly by the seat of your pants. Just the plotting is loose, the dialogue's being written as it's being inked. It's very much an early project, and I appreciate that about it. That's not to say it's not formed, because it is, but when you look at Vasquez's interviews, there are a lot of things about it that he would change going forward. So it's interesting from that point as well to see the evolution of the artist, because he would go on to create Invader Zim, which is personally one of my favorite cartoons, just overall. But this is dark, brutal, angry. It follows Johnny, who mostly kills people he does not like. It's a series of vignettes. There's also a lot of ruminations on life, pontifications on just consumerism, food. There's always been a thing with food that Vasquez has in all of his works. He's very disgusted by some of the processes by which it's created. It's also a very violent work. It's just a fascinating read for me. And like I said, it's a book that I have an interesting relationship with, because there was a time period where I couldn't read this book for a couple of years. It sat there and I couldn't reread it because I had kids. And with my first two children, for some reason, the stories with Squee, who's the little neighbor of Johnny and who's been neglected by his parents, and Johnny kind of becomes this mentor figure for him, at least on Johnny's side, and poor Squee is just so terrified the entire time. I had a hard time reading about Squee being neglected like that, but over time I've come back to being able to read. I don't know. Just been a cycle with it. There's just moments in this that have stuck with me forever. It's just very visceral. There's one, and I'm sure it stuck with a lot of people, which is where you see that Johnny is constantly painting this wall with fresh blood because he's trying to keep it red, and he's going on and on about how the color doesn't stay right unless he keeps it wet. And there's just, I can imagine how gross that would smell. Just the iron that would be in that room. I don't know. It's a really minute detail, but it stuck with me. This is a very fascinating read. It's also interesting in that in some ways Vasquez is now uncomfortable with it, because with the younger fan base he garnered through Zim, they would go back to look for some of his work and then they'd find this. And that wasn't something he was entirely comfortable with. So that was just something else that I always found interesting to think about on a meta level. Just the idea that as you grow in age, how are you going to feel about your work? If you're looking for something that's a bit more out there, if you're trying to get into the alternative comic scene and you like the goth scene as well, because that's very heavy into this, then Johnny, JTHM as it's sometimes abbreviated to. Next up, Astro City, all of it. But I had to pick one, so I picked the first graphic novel, Life in the Big City, which you can find now. They're re-releasing Metro books. They're getting closer and closer to the issues that I don't have, but I see they've stopped putting updates. Now I'm frightened that they're not going to get to the ones I'm missing. Please, I need to get to the end of the 52 of the new run. So Astro City is by Kurt Busiek, and off times with Brent Anderson and Alex Ross, at least for this one you have that. And it is the story set in Astro City and around it, and it's basically all a bunch of vignettes or short one-shots for the most part, although you will have interconnected stories as it goes on about the heroes and villains and civilians inside of Astro City. And just as you read through it, you start to get this complete tapestry of the city, not just in the present, but in different eras, about certain conflicts that have gone on, about the relationships between the characters, and just the way the world building is employed in this. I really enjoy. It's one of the things that always keeps me coming back to Astro City whenever it re-releases. I picked this one this is the first few issues, 1 to 6, from 1995, from the first ever little run that they did, because it's shifted publishers a few times, because it's a very good snapshot of what the series is like. It happens to have one of my favorite characters in the universe in it, which is the Samaritan. His real name's Asa Martin, do you get it? But he's not always prominently featured, but there are 2 stories for him in here, and actually we've talked about both of them on this channel. One is his first adventure, where you learn about what his headspace is and how lonely he is and how much he wishes he could just take some time to fly, but he doesn't. And in the same issue, you have the date he goes on with Winged Victory, which is a disaster, but in a very interesting way. And so we covered that as well. So if you're a fan of intense world building and you're looking for heroes who aren't really the main heroes who you're usually reading, or also villains or, again, civilians, so you get those multiple perspectives, Astro City is worth checking out. Life in the Big City is a good one to see if you're going to be into the tone of the way the stories are told, because that's very consistent throughout it because you have the same writer working on it. So you can get a pretty good inkling right away of whether it's going to be to your taste or not. I'm thinking about replacing mine. I don't know if you can see it, but it got water damage at the top. It's okay. It's all right. It's not to the point where you can't read it. It just shows that it's loved. It's lived some life. This was one I just picked up. That was how I used to grab comics. Now that I'm more into the hobby, I'm a bit more researched as to what's out there, but at the time, just grabbing stuff off the shelf, and sometimes it was great and sometimes it was very meh or bad. I've talked about this series multiple times on this channel. I'll always be the first to come and recommend it. One of my favorites, and I often do grab this issue specifically when I'm looking for it to read. It was either this or Lover's Quarrel. Next up, something else that's been featured heavily on this channel, Tom Strong. All of it. So this happens to be the compendium. It collects the first run of the original Tom Strong from ABC Comics. It's got the main 36 issues in here, so it doesn't have the crossovers Tom did with some of the other characters in that universe, and it doesn't have the later stories where Tom returns, and it doesn't have the DC stuff where he's rolled into the universe later on. This is just OG Tom. A lot of these are by Alan Moore. He created the character with Chris Sprouse, but then eventually as it goes on, it's taken on by other writers. As you can see, this is a DC comic and he vowed not to work with them again, but at the time when he agreed to work with it, it wasn't DC. Then he'd already agreed to work with a lot of the people on the book, and he wasn't liaising with DC directly, so they worked on it for a while. This, contrary to the Watchmen, which is very much a deconstructive look at heroes, this is a much more traditional reconstruction love letter to superheroes, specifically those science heroes and the comics of the Golden and Silver Ages. Despite what he will say about it and how it's simple and trite and not worth looking at, it's still very nuanced and emotionally complex. It's not really as simple as he puts it down as. Just because some of the base ideas are quick to explain doesn't mean that there's not a depth in here, and there's a lot of fun to be had in this book. If you're just a fan of those classic style adventures and those worlds where anything could happen, and there's robot butlers, and there's talking apes, and there's adventures in space, but in time, in the West, and all those things, everything is happening in Tom Strong. But it's also, as it goes on, building and connecting all of these details to bring together what, in my opinion, is one of the best multiverse, alternate universe stories I've ever read. It's just a very good example of how to do it, an alternate version of a character, correctly, in my opinion. We've talked about it on the list of I did a top list for Tom, some of the best stories in here, in my opinion. Tom is just cool and fun, and if you're looking to get a bit of that vibe of those older type of comics, but you can't deal with the writing style of them or some of the tropes of the time, this is a fun way to kind of approximate that experience. But it's doing it in such a way where it's not trying to be a one-to-one. It's just taking some of those tropes and ideas that were in play from the time and working with them in more style, but not in the deconstruction sense. These are very good. I'd recommend it. My copy's getting warped, even though it's a bit new, because my kids are picking it up and reading it, and they shove him back on the shelf, and so he gets all warped. But it's good. I'm glad he's being loved. In the penultimate spot, we have the one exception to the Omni Rule, the Fantastic Four Omnibus, Volume 1 from the original Stan Lee and Jack Kirby era. This one collects issues 1 to 30. So these stories start in 1961. They're foundational. It's the first family. This is what transitions Marvel into Marvel Comics away from Atlas. It starts their renaissance. So while DC Comics is in the Silver Age, and it's the Silver Age overall, Marvel Comics is having a renaissance, which is going to be very different from what's going on at DC. And obviously they're under different circumstances, because a lot of what's going on with the code is directly talking about DC. It's very different to come in as a company that is presenting itself almost as a new company with new characters. There are very concrete reasons for the differences between DC and Marvel at the time, and they're very fascinating though. The Fantastic Four are just one of my favorite teams. And even though this isn't my favorite era for them, for some reason, when I go to pick up something to read, I will often grab these. There's just something very fun about these original stories and seeing the origin points of so many characters who are still around and fairly similar to this day. Doctor Doom, the Namor Sue, all of that. Sue's wig room. Yes, that's why I take out the hate monger issue. You get the Impossible Man, you get the Reed and Doom rivalry stuff. These stories, in my opinion, are very fun to revisit. They are of their time, of course, and so some can't get behind some of the tropes at play or some of the clunky Marvel method that's on display at points, but also it showcases when it really works, and there are some interesting things here. If you're the type of person who likes to go back and see how things started, which I am, this is definitely one of the more accessible ones that I've read, and it also has a soft spot because, again, it's something that my kids pick up and flip through, and it gets them really excited. Just the ideas in here about all of the science and the villains, they're really excited about it, and that's fun to see. You can see that it still ignites the imagination, which it was supposed to. And I feel like that's part of the fondness I have for it and for this era, which is why I go back to it. That, and I just find it interesting from the standpoint of the way I like to explore things, which is to go back and see how they started and all of that stuff. So this is my one Omni exception on this list. It's also, I don't think that's a coincidence, it's one of the lighter ones. Look at me throw it around. If there was going to be an honorable mention for an Omni, it would be the Green Lantern Omnis for Jeff Johns' run. They're down there, and they're too heavy for me to get. I'm not going to do it. So I saved my most controversial choice for last. Also, I have quotes for it, so get excited. So you remember earlier on this list, ages ago, we had Watchmen. Well, get ready. It's for something that people, they were angry about this. Before Watchmen, I have all of the Before Watchmen, every single one, and I will revisit them. They are something I grab a lot, but this one, and you can even see, because look, it's broken. It's actually broken here on the spine because I have read it so much that the spine has started to separate. So this was the one that has Night Owl, Dr. Manhattan, and the Moloch story is in here too. It's not on the cover. All of them are by Dan Straczynski, but they have different art throughout. For Night Owl, the art is by Andy and Joe Kubert. For Dr. Manhattan, it's Adam Hughes. And for the Moloch, it's Eduardo Riso. These came out in 2012. They weren't a continuation, they were prequels. They were supposed to be set, as obviously by the title, before Watchmen. So they're supposed to be filling in some gaps, and they're different artists' interpretations on those things. Some of them are taking from ideas that Moore himself wanted to do, specifically the Minutemen one, because they were thinking about, if it did well at the time when they were still on good terms, he wanted to do a series for that, for the 1940s stuff. Because despite all of the curmudgeonly anger towards comics that is present in Moore now, if you read something like Strong, you can see that there was also a great love for them there. There were also things that DC wanted to do as prequels, but didn't end up happening at the time, such as a Rorschach's Journal series or a Comedian's War Vietnam Diary series, which is highly amusing to me when you think about how Moore feels about those characters specifically. Now, you don't need these at all. The story, Watchmen by itself, it stands on its own, but I find these interesting because I like seeing other people's interpretations, what they got out of it. And there were some elements in the original story that I thought would be interesting to see expanded upon. I like this one because it has some more Night Owl stuff, which I feel like gives Night Owl a bit more oomph. You get to see his relationship with the Twilight Lady, because you just see that one picture in the original one, and I was curious about that. It's not the most interesting story, but I thought it was fun. I liked playing with it. Basically, I view these almost like sanctioned fanfiction, which a lot of things are, and I think it's fun. You also get to see a bit more of his friendship with Rorschach before Rorschach is broken, so that's nice too. The Dr. Manhattan one, I think, stands out, and I think it comes very close to approximating the tone of the original Watchmen comic, and it also flips the exchange between Adrian and Dr. Manhattan, which I think that little moment at the end of the Watchmen when you get that moment of on-panel actually spoken out loud weakness, and it's so small and so brief and so easy to miss from Adrian, because all of the other times his anguish is confined to either that parallel comic story that's being told or things like his action figures on the desk. So to actually see that and to see it from Dr. Manhattan's perspective, even though I don't necessarily agree with the perspective presented here, is fascinating. For me, my favorite was the Moloch story. It just really highlights some of the horrific and evil things that Adrian does in the service of saving the world. So I thought these were interesting. I have quotes because they did, of course, ask, because Moore's hatred of everything that's happened is so famous. So I have quotes from Gibbons and him. And now Gibbons isn't as vitriolic or bitter, but there is some shade inside of his as well. So let me read you what they said about this series. Gibbons stated, "The original series of Watchmen is the complete story that Alan Moore and I wanted to tell. However, I appreciate DC's reasons for this initiative and the wish of the artists and writers involved to pay tribute to our work. May these new additions have the success they desire." The shade it's light, but it's there. It's like a little needle just poked under the skin. Now, for someone who's not being coy at all, Moore stated, "What the comics industry has effectively said is, yes, this was the only book that made us briefly special, and that was because it wasn't like all the other books. It's not like other girls. Watchmen was something that stood on its own, and it had the integrity of a literary work. What they've decided now is, so let's change it to a regular comic that can run indefinitely and have spin-offs, and let's make it as unexceptional as possible. Like I say, they're doing this because they haven't got any other choices left, evidently." Shots fired. Officer down. Now the thing is, some took this as you shouldn't even touch these. There are some, because as I've mentioned, there is an intense Alan Moore, I don't want to say fanaticism. It's not fanaticism, but just almost like his words are gospel. So some people won't even look at these. They won't give them the time of day because he doesn't like them and the author has spoken. That's just not how I look at these things personally. I find it interesting. I found a lot of enjoyment in them, and to me it didn't detract from or take away from the original Watchmen, which I also really enjoy, but just, it's something separate. Like, alternate universe separate fanfic takes is how I slot them in my mind. It's not the kind of thing where I feel like they have any strong impact because the work stands alone. But that's just my take. I love it. I'll keep reading it. I'll probably have to replace it. There's an Omni now and that tempts me, but I have all of them already, so I don't need it. But broken. I loved it too hard. So yes, that was my rambly explanation of some of my favorites on my shelf that I pick up all the time. My shelf's looking a bit empty because I pulled them off. I gotta put them back on. If you like this type of video, there are other types of things I could explore on the shelf and why they're there. I hope that this maybe gave you something to read, something you're interested in. I just want to bounce off what you thought. What are some of your faves that you just love for reasons? Maybe not necessarily because they're important or even the best, but just they're for you. I want to hear that down below. Now, this was a lot. I enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. Your thoughts, put them down below. I want to hear them. Like, share, comment, subscribe, hit the bell notifications so that you never miss a vid. Thanks so much for taking some time to discussing comics with me. I always appreciate it, and I will see you again soon. There's more going to be added to these shelves. This list could change over time. Let's do it again in 5 years. Okay, see you again. Bye-bye.